So how much is it going to cost you? That's up to the homeowner to determine by going out, getting some prices, checking with contractors. If they can do the work themselves, well, so be it. We don't do any of that. We don't recommend anybody. All we indicate is if you increase your attic insulation up to this level, this is what we estimate will be your savings. And with the current EnerGuide grants that are available for anybody in the province, you'll get a $300 grant for that as well. Okay? Main walls. If we add R10 rigid insulation to all of your exterior walls, you'll save an estimate of $247 a year, and the grant or incentive will be $1,500. Now, these are old numbers, so don't look at these grants as being the be-all and end-all, but they're in that range. Okay, and insulating your basement walls, upgrading your windows. You can see that by going to an Energy Star Zone C windows, you're going to save about $200 a year. And your incentive is based on the number of windows that you end up changing. And heating system and domestic hot water. So this chart here is the provincial grant that's available. This is how much you'd save on your utility bill based on today's rates for natural gas. And most of the houses in Saskatchewan are heated with natural gas. So something else to consider here is some people say, well, I'm going to get the grant for doing this, that's what I'm going to do. That's not always the right thing to do, because the grants and what you save don't necessarily go hand in hand. Think of the grant as a one-time thing. Think of your energy savings as a grant each and every year for the next 20 to 50 years, depending on how long you live in your house. So if you're going to be changing out your furnace with this one here, 94 AFUE DC motor, you're going to get a one-time grant of about $600, but you could save $500 a year this year. Next year you're going to save it again, and the year after, and the year after, and the year after. So usually it's best to make your decision about what to upgrade, where to invest your money on the savings, not necessarily on the grant. The grant is just a nice sort of top-up to help you along the way in that initial cost of doing those upgrades. Okay? So this summary chart here sort of gives you a snapshot of your house the way it currently sits, and the potentials for you to make some decisions here as to what's it going to cost you to do these upgrades, what's the estimated savings, and what's the grant associated with it as well.
So if I have a client that's coming to you and we know he's going to go upgrade to our 50 walls on the outside, could you use that input, or are you restricted to just using an ad or a 10?
We can put on there whatever you want, but the grants are limited out by,
yes.
These grant numbers are not 100% correct because they're still under the old program. Okay? And the new program is fairly similar, but they're not quite exactly the same. Yes, we can do the, if you've currently got a 2x4 R12 wall and you want to add an R30 to it, we can model that and we can show you the difference in heat loss through that component.
And
yes.
The energy savings.
And the energy savings, that's right.
So all we have to do is tell the client when he's doing your first inspection with you that he intends to go to...
Yes.
Perfect.
Now, the grant tops out at adding an R10. So whether you add an R10 or an R50, doesn't matter, the grant is going to be the same thing. It's the savings here that will change, right? But after a while, you get to the point where going the extra R10 isn't going to make much of a difference, because if you're already at an R10 or an R20, adding an R10 will have a significant impact. Once you get to R30 and R40 that you're adding, pretty soon it's the law of diminishing returns. And so where's the sweet spot? Where's the savings going to be maximized for the amount of money that you're putting into it?
That's right.
Yep. So we can do that with any component that's there, whether it be upgrading your furnace, windows, insulation, air sealing, whatever it happens to be. We can model different things one at a time and show you what the savings are. And the savings are cumulative except for with the furnace, because as you lower the heat loss, upgrading your furnace has less of an impact because your heat loss is that much lower already. So most everything else is cumulative except for when you change the furnace in combination with some other upgrades. And that's what we've got at the bottom here as well. Okay.
Could you model solar thermal domestic hot water? Because it's a $1,000 grant, right?
Yes, to some degree we can. The software isn't super sensitive to the renewables yet. We can model wind just with a kilowatt hour input, we can model drain water heat recovery within reason and things like that, but it's not very sophisticated. Sometimes you got to go to the RetScreen software rather than the Hot 2000 software, which this is based on, to get more definite numbers and more realistic savings. Yes. So solar domestic hot water, PVs would simply be an electrical credit, but the electrical credits end up being translated into rating points, well, the savings are there as well, because we're in Saskatchewan, we're paying about 10 cents a kilowatt hour for our electricity when you're purchasing it. If you put it back into the grid, I'm not sure what that is, but you can look at it from that point of view too if you want to look at doing renewables. The other thing that we can do here, whether it makes sense or not, is switching fuels. So if you want to change from natural gas to propane, or from propane to electricity in a geothermal situation, we can do that as well. Obviously your natural gas consumption will go to zero, but your electrical will go way up. It's a question of what's the net to the homeowner, okay? So we can do that as well. So you can do some comparisons, making significant changes as to how you're operating your house. Okay, so there's the baseline of what we want to do there. A couple of other things that we always have to keep in mind is when you're doing upgrades, you got to make sure that you're not doing things that are going to cause problems. Because we've had a lot of people who already have gone in and changed windows or changed their furnace, and now all of a sudden, changed their furnace and their windows at the same time, and all of a sudden, even though they got better windows, they're now condensing more than they were before. Well, what's going on? What's ended up happening is that they've sealed up their house a lot because they've taken out the chimney, they've sealed up all the cracks around the windows that were there before with the new windows they don't have, so now their house is tighter, not being ventilated as much, and the moisture that's being generated is much higher, and now even though they're better windows, they're got more condensation on them than they did before. So things are sort of tied to each other, everything interacts with each other, and that's called the house as a system concept, where air leakage, ventilation, heat loss, moisture control, everything is sort of tied together and intertwined, and so you sort of got to make the right decisions. Maybe an even better example is if you go ahead and you do a whole bunch of air sealing in your house. You take off the baseboards and you caulk and you put in those sponge gaskets under the outlets and you seal up your attic access, and now all of a sudden you've cut most of the drafts out, but now what has that done? It's impaired, or it's created a situation where you're keeping everything in the house, so your air quality goes down, your moisture levels go up because you're not losing all that moisture out to the environment, and so you're created problems. So anytime you're doing air sealing, you also have to look at the ventilation and air exchange side of things, because they are sort of tied together. It's like putting a balloon or a bag over your head. You can't live like that, and that's sort of what happens if you air seal your house too much without addressing the ventilation side of it as well. So everything has sort of a consequence when you do something. Changing out the furnace, you take out the great big open chimney, that cuts off the 24 hours ventilation that chimney was given to the house, and now you've got a tighter house. Or like I said, when you're changing out windows, you're insulating, you typically have a better air barrier, you're putting foam on the outside or an air barrier on the outside of your house, and that seals it up. Now you got to make sure you ventilate on the everything is sort of tied together, so you have to sort of know how all of these things work together and what sort of problems you might be creating. Even though you're doing the right thing to stop heat loss, you may be creating other issues that you got to deal with as well. Okay. Any questions?
Duplex, is it just double? Is that how it works? Or?
Well, a duplex, because typically the way duplex terminology is quite a bit different here than it is in Eastern Ontario, or in Eastern Canada, in Ontario and Quebec. They call duplex an up and down, whereas in Saskatchewan we call duplex as a side-by-side or a row house. Yeah. And typically they have is a common wall, a party wall, a fire wall, whatever you want to call it there, and we would look at each side independently as an attached or a row house is how we would treat it. So effectively it has basically 3 exterior walls and a common wall that has some air leakage but no heat loss, because the heat loss is determined by the temperature difference, and the temperature on each side is the same, and as a result there's no heat transfer from one side to the other. So it's basically a house with 3 walls, 3 exterior walls. Okay?
For the grants?
Again, the grants for the walls are 3/4 of what they are for a single detached house. The attic the ceiling grant is the same because it's got the same ceiling area. The foundation walls are 3/4 of what they are. If you've got a row condo or something, and if it's a middle unit, then it's half, because you have 2 common walls and 2 exterior walls. And so
But mine is actually an up-down duplex, so just have one ceiling but 4 walls. So is that-
So in that particular case, it depends on the configuration. If it's got a common hallway, we would just look at it as a house and just open it up, even though there's 2 separate dwelling units. If they have separate exterior entrances and no common stairwell, no common entrance, because we have to air test the whole structure, the whole building. So we can, from one of the exterior doors, draw the air from both suites, that we could look at it as one big house. Otherwise, we would have to do 2 separate blower door tests, and then look at the integrity of the ceiling floor interface, because that's where, just flipping on sideways, that would be like a common wall or a common floor in this particular case.
I'm more interested in the grants. Would I get double grants? I got 2 furnaces, 2 water heaters.
In the current, we would probably still look at it as a house, Ron, because the cost of evaluating as a duplex, we have to look at it as a multi-unit residential building, which is more labor intensive. On a regular house, you get a certain incentive for the first furnace and half of the incentive for the second one. So even if it's just a regular single-family house, if it has 2 furnaces in, you get the grant for the first furnace, which is $650, and the grant for the second one is $325. So you still get half of it for that second furnace. Yeah. So in your description of a duplex, it's a toss-up whether we would do it as one big house or as a 2-unit dwelling, but there it's a MERB, and it's going to cost extra for the evaluation costs. This is the grant tables that the province of Saskatchewan has published. It's the current Saskatchewan EnerGuide for Houses program, and it came into effect April the 1st and is scheduled to go until the summer of 2013, about 2 years from now. We're still waiting to hear whether or not there's going to be a federal program or not. We should probably know something sometime in June as to whether it gets announced and whether there's any funding there for it or not. This is on the Sunridge website. If you go to sunridgegroup.ca and to the EnerGuide program, it'll all be on there. And again, these are available from our office or anywhere else. And so if we just pick a few things, this first panel here is basically on heating systems, whether it's a natural gas furnace, an oil furnace. There's some stuff in here for geothermal systems if you don't have access to natural gas. The middle panel's got domestic hot water and ventilation systems. You get an incentive for putting an HRV in if you just have an exhaust-only ventilation system. Then there's attic insulation, basement wall insulation, exterior main floor wall insulation, crawl spaces, windows and doors. Something new to the program that hasn't been there before was light fixtures. If you install 3 or more Energy Star light fixtures, you get a small incentive. I think it's $45. If you put in Energy Star clothes washers or dryers or natural gas dryers, you get some incentives for doing that as well. Something that hasn't existed in previous programs. So there's a whole bunch of different things here that have some incentives tied to them. So the numbers that you see up here are not quite correct because they're from the last program. This grant table has got all the current information in it as to what has incentives tied to it and what those incentives are. Okay. Any questions? Any more questions?
No, that was awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, if you don't know what to do, whether you get any grants or not, it only costs the net to you is $150. The real cost of the evaluation is, you need to get the evaluation prior to starting the work, or any work you do prior to that you won't get credit for. So that's the first thing. The full cost of the evaluation is $300, but the province of Saskatchewan is subsidizing it to the 50%. So the net to the homeowner is only $150 plus GST, and the information you get from it is quite good. At least that shows you, gives you the information you need to make the right decision.